The settlement at the base of Beartooth Ridge was little more than a scar of muddy ruts and raw lumber, clinging to the edge of the Idaho Territory. It was the last stop before the world gave way to sheer rock and timbered slopes that clawed at the sky. Clara Boone sat her horse, a tired-looking bay, and pulled the collar of her thin coat tighter. The wind had a mean streak, carrying the first hints of a winter that promised to be brutal. She had been asking for 2 days. The men in the saloon, the only public house in the settlement, had treated her question as a joke. Elias Carver, a man with a beard stained yellow from tobacco, had laughed, showing the gaps in his teeth. "Lady, Carver don't hire anyone, let alone—" He waved a greasy hand in her direction, taking in the worn men's boots and the desperation she was trying so hard to hide. "He hires laborers for his logging camp. I heard—" she insisted, keeping her voice steady. "He runs a trap line, mostly," the barkeep corrected, wiping a glass with a dirty rag. "And he don't have a camp. He has a cabin, and he works it alone. Has for nigh on 5 years, since the trouble." "What trouble?" Clara had asked. The man shrugged. "Man's trouble? Nothing for you to worry on. He doesn't hire women. He don't even like seeing them." Now, she looked up at the trail. It was less a trail and more a rumor. A narrow cut in the pines that went straight up. The men had told her it was 10 miles of hard climb. They had warned her not to go. They had offered her other work, the kind that came with a rented room above the saloon and required no heavy lifting. Clara had ignored them. She had spent her last 40 cents on a small bag of oats for the bay and a heel of stale bread for herself. She was running from a past that had burned her life to the ground. The gossip, the accusations, the soft hands of men who thought a woman's ruin was their opportunity. She was not looking for a husband or a savior. She was looking for work. She was looking for a place so high and cold the whispers could not reach her. She swung her leg over the horse, her muscles aching. Her boots, worn through men's boots she had traded for in Cheyenne, hit the frozen mud with a dull sound. She led the bay toward the trail. He was a good horse, but he was tired, and the climb looked impossible. "This is it," she whispered to the animal, patting his neck. "This is the last chance." The logging trail was a liar. It started wide enough, littered with pine needles and the occasional stump. But within a mile, it narrowed to a slick channel of ice and rock. The wind grew louder, a high, mournful sound that sifted through the branches. Clara walked, pulling the bay along. The horse stumbled, his iron shoes finding no purchase on the slick stones. She pulled harder, her hands raw inside her thin gloves. She wore her entire life on her back, the coat, a flannel shirt, a wool skirt over a pair of men's trousers, and a small carpet bag tied to the saddle. 3 miles up, the horse stopped. He planted his feet, snorted a plume of white air, and refused to move. The trail ahead was a steep switchback covered in a treacherous sheet of frozen meltwater. "Come on," Clara pleaded, tugging the reins. "Please, we have to keep going." The horse pulled back, his eyes wide with fear. He slipped, his hindquarters crashing against the rock wall of the cut. He scrambled, panicked, and wrenched the reins from her frozen grip. The leather strap snapped. "No!" Clara cried. The horse, free and terrified, turned. He scrambled back down the trail, slipping and finding his footing, desperate for level ground. Clara watched him go, her last companion, her last valuable possession. She watched until the sound of his crashing retreat was eaten by the wind. She stood alone on the trail for a long time. The cold, which had been a dull ache, now began to bite. She could go back. She could walk the 3 miles down to the settlement, admit defeat, and take the room above the saloon. She could sell the only thing she had left. Clara turned her face toward the ridge. The wind whipped her hair, stinging her cheeks. She thought of the man she had killed. She thought of the courtroom, the whispers of seductress, the way her father's gambling debts had left her prey to men who saw her as just another asset to be claimed. No, she would rather freeze on this mountain than go back. She adjusted the small bag on her own shoulder and began to climb. The sun was a pale wafer, hidden behind a sky the color of dirty pewter. Snow began to fall. Not a gentle drift, but hard, stinging pellets that drove against her face. The trail was obscured, and twice she wandered off it, finding herself in deep drifts that stole her strength. Her legs were numb, her lungs burned. The world shrank to the next step, and the one after that. Darkness was falling when she saw it. Smoke. A thin, gray ribbon pulled from a stone chimney, disappearing against the gray sky. Hope gave her a last burst of energy. She stumbled through the trees, off the trail again, pushing through waist-deep snow. She saw the cabin. It was small, built of massive logs chinked with mud, banked with earth against the cold. A fortress. She reached the small clearing and fell. She tried to get up, but her legs would not obey. She was covered in snow, a frozen mound just 20 yards from the door. "Help!" she tried to call, but her voice was a frozen croak. She saw the door open. A man emerged, a shadow against the dim light from within. He was huge, larger than she could have imagined. Wrapped in furs, he held a rifle. He did not move for a moment, just watched her. He probably thought she was an animal, a wounded deer. Clara lifted one hand, a gesture of supplication. Before the darkness finally took her, she fainted in the snow, the smell of wood smoke in her nostrils. Elias Carver cursed. He had seen the shape fall in the clearing and had grabbed his rifle, thinking it was a wolf grown bold. But it was a woman, a damned woman, half frozen on his doorstep. He walked over, his boots crunching in the new snow. He nudged her with his toe. She was real. He knelt, turning her over. She was young, her face pale as porcelain and streaked with dirt. Her lips were blue. "Damnation," he muttered again, the word ripped away by the wind. He didn't want this. He had come up here precisely to be away from this, away from towns and laws and complications. And women were the biggest complication of all. He could leave her. The storm would cover her by morning. It would be an accident. He looked at her face. Still, like a doll's, he thought of the trouble. 5 years ago, the fight, the man who hadn't gotten up. He had blood on his hands, but he wasn't a murderer. Not this way. With a groan of frustration, he scooped her up. She weighed almost nothing, a bundle of wet wool and frozen limbs. He carried her inside, kicking the heavy plank door shut against the howling wind. The cabin was one room, clean but rough. A stone hearth dominated one wall, a bed built into the other. Furs, traps, and tools hung from the rafters. It smelled of pine, cured meat, and solitude. He laid her on the bearskin rug in front of the fire. Not on his bed. He pulled off her frozen, oversized boots. Her feet were wrapped in rags, soaked and stiff. He unbuttoned her coat and pulled it off. Underneath, she was thin, trembling violently now as the warmth began to penetrate. He threw a heavy wool blanket over her. He went to the stove, poured coffee from the pot into a tin mug, and added a heavy splash of whiskey from the bottle on the shelf. He sat on his stool across the room, watching her, his rifle resting against his knee. He did not trust this. It felt like a trap. Clara woke in stages. First came the warmth, a painful, stinging heat in her hands and feet. Then came the smell of the fire. She heard it crackle. She was lying on something soft, fur. She opened her eyes. The firelight flickered on the low, beamed ceiling. She was inside. She sat up too quickly, and the room spun. The wool blanket fell away. "Don't move." The voice was rough, like gravel rolling downhill. She froze. Across the room, shrouded in the shadows away from the fire, sat the man. She could only make out his shape, broad and still. "Where am I?" she whispered. "My cabin. You fainted in the yard." "Carver?" "Elias Carver," he confirmed. His voice was flat, devoid of welcome. You should have stayed in the settlement. The trail's closed. You lost your horse. It wasn't a question. He must have seen her tracks. Or the broken rein. It broke loose, she said, her voice stronger. She pushed her damp hair back from her face. It doesn't matter. I'm Clara Boone. I don't care who you are. When the storm breaks, you're leaving. No. She tried to stand, pulling the blanket around her. She was dizzy, but she got to her feet. No, I'm not leaving. I'm here for the work. Elias stood up. He moved out of the shadow, and Clara had to fight the urge to step back. He was tall, well over 6 feet, and built like the trees outside. He had a thick, dark beard and hair, and his eyes, in the firelight, looked as cold as the ice on the trail. He scoffed, a short, humorless sound. Work? There's no work for you here. Girl, I run traps. I cut timber. It's man's work. I heard you hire laborers. I don't. I can work, she insisted, her desperation making her bold. I'm not looking for charity, Mr. Carver. And I'm not here to marry. I'm not looking for protection. I'm here to work. He looked her up and down, his gaze lingering on her thin frame, her soaked skirt. You look like you'd break in half hauling a water bucket. Try me. He stepped closer, and she smelled the cold air on him, and smoke, and something animal. I don't need a woman in my cabin. I don't want the complication. I won't be a complication, Clara said, lifting her chin. She hated the pleading in her own voice, but she had no choice. I can cook. I can clean your cabin. I can mend your clothes. I can skin a rabbit. I can learn to check traps. I'm stronger than I look. And I won't talk. If that's what you want, I just need a roof and food. I can't go back down. Elias stared at her, his expression unreadable. He saw the steel in her eyes, behind the exhaustion. He saw she was telling the truth. She wasn't a saloon girl looking for an easy mark. She was something else, something broken, and something stubborn. He hated it. He hated the intrusion. He had built this life to keep the world out. And now the world had fallen on his porch. But he also heard the truth in her voice. I can't go back down. He knew what that felt like. He turned away from her, staring into the fire. The silence stretched, broken only by the shriek of the wind outside. 1 week, he said finally, his back still to her. Clara let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. You get 1 week, he continued, turning back. His eyes were hard. You prove you can do what you say. You cook, you clean, you haul your own water. You don't slow me down. You don't complain, and you stay out of my way. You get in my way, or you fall behind. I'm taking you back to the settlement myself. Storm or no. You understand? I understand. There's a loft. He pointed a thick finger upward. That's where you sleep. The blankets are up there. Thank you, Mr. Carver. Don't thank me, he growled. I'm already regretting it. He handed her the tin mug of coffee and whiskey. Drink that. Your boots are by the fire. You can set your bag in the loft. My name is Elias. Don't call me Mr. He picked up his rifle, checked the action, and set it back on the pegs by the door. He sat back down on his stool, picked up a piece of wood, and began to carve, acting as if she were no longer there. The tension in the following days was as thick as the frost on the window panes. The cabin was 1 room, and there was no escaping each other's presence. Clara slept in the loft, a cold, dark space with a straw-tick mattress and 2 heavy wool blankets. She climbed the ladder each night and lay there, listening to the sounds of the man below, the scrape of his boot, the rustle of him turning in his bed, the low murmur of him talking in his sleep. Elias kept his distance. He was a man of absolute, unnerving silence. He rose hours before the sun. The scrape of the kindling box, the only alarm. He would be gone by the time Clara climbed down the ladder, a fresh pot of coffee already simmering on the stove. He would return late, just as darkness fell. often carrying a brace of rabbits or a heavy pelt. He would wordlessly hand her the game, and she would set about cooking. They ate in silence at the small, rough-hewn table, the first meal she made. A thin rabbit stew bulked up with the last of her dried beans. He ate without comment. He simply finished the bowl, pushed it away, and went back to mending a trap. Clara worked until her muscles screamed. She hauled water from the creek, a brutal task that involved cracking the ice with a hatchet and carrying the two heavy, sloshing buckets back to the cabin. The water would freeze in the buckets by the time she got inside, a solid ring of ice forming around the edges in just the few minutes it took to walk. The wilderness was not just quiet, it was loud with threat. The wind never stopped. It was a high, thin wail that sounded like a woman grieving. At night, the wolves came. Their howls were not the distant, romantic calls she had read about in books. They were close, hungry, and full of menace. They made the hair on her neck stand up. But Elias seemed not to hear them. One afternoon, a sound like distant thunder rolled through the valley, shaking the very logs of the cabin. Dust sifted from the rafters. "What was that?" Clara asked, her heart pounding. Elias was oiling his rifle by the fire. He didn't look up. "Avalanche, on the west ridge. It's miles off." He said it with the same indifference he might use to comment on the weather. The mountain was his home, and he understood its violent language. Clara learned to read him by his movements, not his words. She watched him. She saw the way he moved, with an economy of motion that wasted nothing. One morning, he brought in a deer, slung over his shoulders. He butchered it outside, in the biting cold. Clara watched from the window, expecting to be sickened, but he worked with a grim, focused respect. His hands, though large and calloused, were precise with the long knife. Steam rose from the carcass into the frigid air. It was not butchery. It was a harvest. It was solemn. She realized, with a start, that this was the first man she had ever seen who seemed to truly belong to the world he inhabited. The most unsettling moment came on the 5th day. The cold snap had broken slightly, and the temperature had risen to just above freezing. Elias declared he was chopping wood for the rest of the day. He worked in the clearing, not far from the cabin. After an hour, Clara saw him stop and pull off his heavy fur-lined coat. A while later, he stopped again and pulled off his flannel shirt. Clara, who was sweeping the hearth, stopped. She watched him through the small, wavy glass of the window. He was working shirtless in the cold, steam rising from his skin. His back was to her. He was lean, but powerfully muscled, and his skin was a map of old scars, not just the nicks and cuts of a life in the woods, but long, pale lines that spoke of violence, a whip, or something worse. He swung the axe with a steady, powerful rhythm, the thud of the blade sinking into the wood, a counterpoint to the howling wind. Men she had known back east were soft, their strength measured in banknotes and loud opinions. The man who had attacked her had been strong, but his was a cruel, sloppy strength, born of whiskey and entitlement. Elias's strength was different. It was quiet. It was part of the mountain. It was solemn, not cruel. It was the strength of survival. And for the first time in a very long time, Clara felt something other than fear. Elias found the locket 2 days later. Her week was almost up. Clara had gone down to the creek, desperate to prove her worth by checking the small snares Elias had allowed her to set for rabbits. He was alone in the cabin, stoking the fire. Her bag, the small carpet bag with the nap worn smooth, had fallen from the loft ladder, spilling its meager contents onto the floor. A spare set of stockings, a bar of soap, and a small, tarnished tin locket. He bent to pick up her things, his large fingers clumsy on the small items. The locket drew his eye. It was cheap, the kind a person might buy from a peddler. He picked it up. He did not mean to open it. It was not his business. But his thumb found the clasp. It sprang open. Inside was not a likeness of a husband or a lover. It was a small, sepia-toned photograph of a child, a boy, no more than 3 or 4 years old, with dark, serious eyes and hair combed flat. Elias's jaw tightened. He had forced himself to see her as a stray, a temporary problem. But this, a child, this meant a past. This meant attachments. This meant a whole world of trouble he had climbed this mountain to escape. Where was the boy? Was he dead? Was she running from a husband? He heard the crunch of her boots on the snow. He closed the locket with a soft click, tucked it back into the bag, and set the bag at the base of the ladder, leaning it against the wall. When Clara entered, cheeks red from the cold, holding up a small, scrawny rabbit with a look of desperate pride, Elias was standing by the fire, his back to her. "I got one," she said, her voice hesitant. Elias turned. His face was like stone, giving nothing away. "Good," he said. "Skin it. It's almost dark." He said nothing about the locket. He said nothing about the boy. But as she took the knife from the hook, she felt his eyes on her. And the silence in the cabin felt different. It was heavier now, and charged with questions he refused to ask. The week Elias had given her came and went. He said nothing. The second week passed, and the only change was that he left a small, tin jar of pine tar salve on the table without a word. Clara found it after a long day of mending a section of fence near the cabin, her hands split and bleeding from handling the frozen wood and wire. She looked at the jar, then at his back as he sat cleaning his rifle. She applied the stinging, sticky balm to her raw knuckles and said nothing. The silence was its own kind of understanding. She had proven she could survive. The work was brutal, a relentless assault on a body softened by years of town life. But she did not stop. She hauled the water. She learned to bank the fire so it would last through the night. She learned to cook the tough, stringy game he brought in, boiling it for hours with wild onions and snowmelt until it was edible. She learned to read the sky, to feel the drop in pressure that meant a new storm was coming, to brace herself for the cold that was a living thing, a predator waiting just outside the door. Elias, in turn, began to trust her with more. He showed her how to reset the snares, how to properly bank the cabin with fresh snow for insulation, how to tell a wolf track from a coyote's. He never praised her. Praise was a luxury, as useless as a silk dress on this mountain. Instead, he simply stopped watching her as if he expected her to collapse or quit. He began to move around the cabin as if he were alone again, a sign of respect more profound than any kind word. She was scrubbing the rough plank floor one afternoon, the harsh lye soap stinging the cuts on her hands. When the memory came for her, it often did when she was tired, the past rising up like a winter fog. She was not in a cabin. She was in the parlor, in Philadelphia. The gas lamps were lit, casting a yellow glow on the velvet curtains and the heavy mahogany furniture. She could smell her father's cigar smoke and the scent of expensive brandy. She was wearing a blue silk dress, her hands soft, her future a settled, comfortable thing. Then, the crash. It had not been loud, but total. Her father, his face gray and papery, admitting it, the gambling, the speculations, the debts, all of it gone. The house, the money, the good name. They were ruined. The whispers had started the next day. The women who had fawned over her now looked through her. The men who had courted her vanished. All except one. Mr. Abernathy, a man twice her father's age, a friend of the family. With a damp handshake and eyes that lingered too long, he had come to the house as the creditors were tagging the furniture, offering assistance. He saw their ruin as his opportunity. The memory sharpened. Focusing on that last night in the study, her father was gone. Locked in his room with a bottle, Abernathy had followed her in, closing the doors. "Clara, my dear," he had said, his voice thick, "a woman of your beauty. You need not suffer this. I can provide for you. You simply need to be accommodating." He had lunged for her. He was not strong, but he was heavy, smelling of sweat and stale wine. He had torn the bodice of her dress. She had stumbled back, her hand hitting the desk. Her fingers closed around the heavy, cut glass inkwell. She hadn't thought. She had just swung. The sound it made against his temple was dull, heavy. He had looked at her, his eyes wide with surprise, before he crumpled to the floor. The inkwell, still in her grip, was sticky with ink and something else. He did not get up. She scrubbed the floor of the cabin harder, the wood biting into her knees. The courtroom, that was the worst of it. The prosecutor, a slick man with a gold watch chain, had not seen a victim. He had seen a seductress. "Miss Boone," he had boomed. Finding her family destitute, attempted to lure Mr. Abernathy, a respected pillar of the community, into a compromising position. When he rebuffed her advances, she flew into a rage. Is that not the truth? "He attacked me," she had whispered over and over. "It was self-defense." But no one believed her. The women in the gallery stared at her with a mix of pity and contempt. A fallen woman, a killer. Her father, broken, could not even meet her gaze. The jury had been undecided, but her reputation was dead. She had been released, but she was a pariah. The gossip painted her as a black widow, a dangerous woman who had used her wiles and then her temper. So she had fled. She had taken what little money she had sewn into her hems and bought a ticket west, and then another and another. She had worked as a seamstress, a laundress, a pie maker in a fly-blown diner in Omaha. She kept moving until the whispers were replaced by the howl of the wind, and the judging eyes of the town were replaced by the vast, indifferent stare of the wilderness. The memory released her. Clara sat back on her heels, her knuckles white, the floorboards dark with scrub water. This was better. The cold, the hunger, the wolves. This was honest. This was a penance she could understand. A storm hit that night, a true blizzard that clawed at the cabin. The wind shrieked, and snow piled in drifts against the door. For 2 days, they were prisoners. The tiny cabin seemed to shrink, the silence stretching thin. Elias sat by the fire, sharpening his skinning knives, his face a mask of concentration. Clara sat at the table, mending one of his heavy wool shirts, her stitches small and neat. The only sounds were the scrape of the whetstone and the snap of the fire. The tension was a third person in the room. Elias finally set the knife down. He reached for the half-empty bottle of whiskey on the mantel. He didn't look at her, but he held it out. "It'll warm your bones," he said. Clara hesitated, then set the shirt aside. She took the bottle, her small hand brushing his. She took a careful sip. The whiskey was raw, tasting of smoke and grain, and it burned all the way down. She coughed, her eyes watering. A sound, almost a chuckle, rumbled in Elias's chest. "It's not Philadelphia brandy." She looked at him, surprised. "How did you know?" He shrugged, taking a long pull from the bottle. "You don't talk like you're from around here. You talk like a woman who's read a book." "I've read many," she said softly. "They didn't prepare me for this." The wind hit the cabin with a sound like a freight train, shaking the heavy logs. "It sounds like the world is ending," she whispered. "Just the mountain talking," Elias replied. "It's better than men talking." He stared into the fire, his eyes reflecting the flames. "Men talk you into trouble." The shared bottle made her bold. "Is that why you came up here? Trouble?" He was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. He turned the bottle in his hands, watching the light play on the glass. "I used to work a lumber crew," he said, his voice low. "Down on the Snake River, big camp, 50 men, loud, dirty, dangerous work." He took another drink. "There was a man, Finch, a bully, always picking on the younger lads, cheating at cards. We had a disagreement over a hand of poker. He said I was cheating. I said he was a liar. We took it outside." He paused, his knuckles white on the bottle. It was stupid, just whiskey and pride, but he pulled a knife. I didn't have one. I just reacted. I grabbed his wrist. We fought. He fell." "You killed him," Clara whispered. "He fell on his own blade," Elias said, but his voice was flat. "Or maybe I pushed him. It happened fast. He was dead before he hit the ground. The crew boss said the sheriff would have to come. Said it was messy. I knew what that meant. A dead man, a dozen drunk witnesses. They'd want someone to hang for it. Finch had family in the next county." He looked at her, his eyes cold, but with a deep, old pain in them. "I didn't wait for a trial. I walked north that night, kept walking till I found this ridge. Been alone since. It's better." Clara stared at her hands, her own secret burning in her chest. "People don't much care for the truth when blood is spilled," she said. Elias stopped, the bottle halfway to his lips. He looked at her, really looked at her, not as a worker, not as an intrusion, but as an equal. He saw the shadow in her eyes, the one that matched his own. He gave a single, sharp nod. The spark of understanding had been struck, and it flickered between them in the stormy silence. The storm passed, leaving the world buried in a blinding, pristine white. The cold was sharp, clean. Elias had been gone since dawn, checking his long trap lines, a grueling 10-mile trek on snowshoes. Clara relished the solitude. She declared it a day for a bath. She spent hours melting snow in the big kettle on the stove until it was blessedly, scaldingly hot. She barred the door, a small, futile gesture, but it made her feel safer. She stripped off her layers of wool and flannel, her skin prickling in the warm air of the cabin. She was down to her chemise, a thin, worn cotton garment, patched in several places. It was the last piece of her old life, soft from 1,000 washings. She poured the hot water into the metal basin, added a splash of cold, and knelt on the bearskin rug before the fire. She untied her hair, letting it fall. It was her one vanity, thick and dark, though now it was lank and smelled of wood smoke. She dipped her head, soaking her hair, working the harsh lye soap into a lather. She was rinsing, the warm water sluicing down her back, when the door swung open. A blast of frigid air hit her bare skin. She gasped, freezing, clutching the front of her chemise. Elias stood there, framed against the bright snow, his rifle in one hand, a string of rabbits in the other. He stopped dead. He had come back early. He saw her kneeling, her hair unbound and streaming with water. He saw the pale, graceful line of her back, the sharp definition of her shoulder blades under the wet, clinging cotton. She was thin, but not frail. The firelight turned the water on her skin to liquid gold. It was a jolt, a punch to the gut. He had forced himself to see her as a pair of hands, a presence to be tolerated. In that instant, she was a woman, vulnerable and luminous, and a fierce, unfamiliar hunger stirred in him. It was followed by a wave of shame. He turned his back immediately, his voice rougher than he intended. "Sorry, didn't mean to bust in. The latch must not have caught." "It's all right," Clara whispered. Her voice was choked. She was mortified, reaching blindly for the rough towel she had set out. She scrubbed at her hair, her face, pulling the towel around her shoulders. Elias stood at the door, his back to her, staring out at the snow-laden trees. He could feel the heat of her in the room, smell the soap. He gripped the door latch so hard his knuckles ached. I'll just fetch more wood." He stepped back outside, pulling the door shut with a solid thud. He stood in the biting cold, his breath pluming, his heart pounding a heavy, angry rhythm. He had just walked 10 miles in the snow, but he felt a desperate need to chop something, to sweat, to drive the image of her from his mind. It was much later, in the dead of night, when the screaming started. It was not a human sound. It was a high, terrified shriek, like a woman being murdered, followed by the frantic squawking and crashing from the small, reinforced chicken coop near the woodpile. Elias was out of his bed before he was fully awake. "Lion," he growled, grabbing the rifle from the pegs. Clara was already halfway down the loft ladder, her heart seizing. "What is it?" "A mountain lion. Stay inside. Bar the door behind me." He unbarred the door and swung it open, the frigid night air flooding the room. Clara did not bar the door. She looked at the hearth, at the small axe used for kindling. She grabbed it. "I'm not—" Elias glanced back, saw her face, pale but set, the axe in her hand. He saw the same steel he'd seen the day she arrived. There was no time to argue. He nodded once, sharply, and plunged into the moonlit snow. The moon was nearly full, casting a brilliant, eerie light on the clearing. The coop was shaking, the last two hens screaming. A large, sleek shadow was on top of it, tearing at the roof planks. Elias raised his rifle, sighting down the barrel. "Get clear!" he yelled. The lion heard him. It snarled, a low, bubbling sound, and dropped from the coop, landing silently in the snow. It was massive. A female, lean and hungry. It saw them and its yellow eyes gleamed. Elias fired. The shot was a deafening crack in the silence. The muzzle flashed blinding. The lion screamed, a sound of pain and fury. The bullet had hit it, but not cleanly. It crouched, then lunged, not at the coop, but at Elias. He tried to bring the rifle butt up to club it, but the cat was impossibly fast. It hit him like a sack of rocks, its claws raking his left side. He went down, the rifle flying from his grip. He roared, grappling with the spitting, clawing animal, trying to keep its teeth from his throat. Clara screamed. It was not a scream of fear, but of pure, primal rage. She ran forward, her bare feet sinking into the snow, and swung the small axe with all her strength. The blade buried itself deep in the lion's flank. The animal shrieked, a terrible, high-pitched sound, and spun off Elias, turning on this new attacker. It swiped at her, claws extended. Clara stumbled back, falling, as Elias rolled, his hand finding the heavy hunting knife on his belt. He surged up, driving the long blade deep under the cat's ribs, pushing it upward with all his weight. The lion shuddered. It clawed at the air, its muscles convulsing. Then, with a long, wet sigh, it collapsed in the snow, its blood staining the white ground. The sudden silence was shocking. Clara and Elias stared at the dead animal, panting, their breath smoking in the air. "Elias?" Clara's voice trembled violently. "Are you hurt?" He was getting to his feet, clutching his shoulder. Blood was dark on his torn nightshirt. "It's done," he panted. He looked at her, at the axe still in her hand, at her bare feet in the snow. He was stunned. She had not frozen. She had not run. She had run at it. "Get inside! You'll freeze!" He retrieved his rifle and nudged the lion with his boot. It was still. He grabbed its tail and began to drag it away from the coop, toward the trees. Clara ran inside, her feet burning with cold. By the time he returned, she had stoked the fire and lit the lamp. He came in, his left side covered in blood. "Sit," she ordered, her voice firm. He grunted, slumping onto the stool, suddenly exhausted. "It tore the coat and the shirt." "Let me see." She brought the water basin, clean rags, and the whiskey bottle. She knelt before him, gently. She pulled the torn, bloody wool and cotton away from his skin. He hissed as the cold air hit the wound. 4 deep gashes ran from his collarbone down his upper arm. They were bleeding freely. "This will sting," she said. She poured whiskey directly into the wounds. Elias stiffened, a low groan in his throat, but he did not pull away. She cleaned the gashes, her touch surprisingly gentle, her movements efficient. His skin was rough under her fingers, and hot, despite the cold. He watched her face, her brow furrowed in concentration, her lips pressed tight. She was no longer trembling. She bandaged him tightly with long strips of a clean flour sack. her hands quick and sure. When she was done, her hands rested on his bandaged shoulder for a moment. Her fingers lingered on his warm skin. Just below the dressing, he looked up at her. She was kneeling, her face close to his. The firelight caught the escaped strands of her still damp hair. He could smell the soap on her and the sharp, coppery tang of his own blood. Their eyes held. The cabin, the mountain, the entire world shrank to the small, warm space between them. The violence they had shared, the blood on the snow, had burned away the polite distance they had kept. He saw the fear in her eyes, but also the courage. She saw the pain in his, but also the raw heat. He lifted his good right hand, his movement slow, hesitant. He was going to touch her face, her hair. Clara pulled back. She stood up abruptly, breaking the spell. She gathered the bloody rags, her back to him. You should rest, in the bed." The moment shattered. Elias dropped his hand, clenching it into a fist. He looked at his fist, then at her rigid back. He gave a short, rough nod. She stood at the table, refusing to look at him, her shoulders trembling. He watched her for a long moment, the ache in his shoulder a dull, distant throb compared to the new, sharper ache that had settled in his chest. He had faced down a mountain lion, but this woman, this fragile, stubborn, courageous woman, terrified him, and he knew, as he watched her, that she was just as terrified of him. Neither of them was ready. The mountain lion was only the beginning. 3 days after the attack, the sky turned a flat, bruised purple, and the wind died. It was a silence more threatening than any howl. "It's here," Elias said, his voice flat. He was standing in the open doorway, staring north. His wounded shoulder, tightly bound, made his movements stiff. "What is?" Clara asked, pausing from kneading a heavy lump of dough. "The real winter." He shut the heavy plank door and dropped the bar. The sound was final. Within an hour, it began. It was not a gentle snow. It was a white, horizontal fury. A solid wall of ice and wind that erased the world. The cabin, which had felt like a fortress, now seemed a fragile chip of wood in a churning, frozen ocean. The wind no longer howled, it screamed, a high, thin sound that vibrated in the teeth. For 4 days, the sun did not rise. There was only a dim gray twilight that seeped through the one small window, which was itself a solid mass of impacted snow. They lived by the light of the fire and the single oil lamp. The world shrank to the 4 log walls. They fell into a grim rhythm of survival. Every few hours, Elias would have to open the door, a feat that required his full weight, and shovel the snow away before it buried them completely. He would return caked in white, his beard a solid block of ice, the cold rolling off him in visible waves. Clara kept broth and coffee perpetually hot on the stove, feeding the fire with a miserly care. The woodpile inside, meant to last a week, was dwindling at an alarming rate. The true enemy was the cold. It was a physical presence, a heavy, suffocating blanket that pressed in from all sides. It found every crack in the chinking, drafts cut like knives. The water buckets, though set near the hearth, were filled with ice every morning. The first night of the blizzard, Clara shivered in the loft, wrapped in every blanket she had. The cold air pooled in the high rafters, and the wind, roaring just inches above her head, seemed to drain every last bit of warmth from her body. She did not sleep. By the second night, she was shaking so hard her teeth chattered. Elias watched her from below. He was sitting on his stool, his bad shoulder hunched, staring into the flames. The cabin was becoming dangerously cold. The fire, though roaring, could not fight the relentless, seeping chill. His own bed, built into the wall, was warmer, but the loft was a death trap. "You'll freeze up there," he said, his voice a low rumble beneath the wind's shriek. Clara, huddled at the top of the ladder, looked down. "I'm fine." "You're lying," he said, not unkindly. "It's foolish. Bring your blankets down." "Where?" He gestured to the floor, to the bearskin rug where she had first woken, and where they had fought the lion. "Here, by the fire. It's the only place." She hesitated. The rug was only a few feet from his bed. "Don't be stupid. Clara!" he growled, the patience gone. "This isn't a town. This is survival. You'll catch a lung fever, and I won't know how to fix it. Get down." She obeyed. She dropped her blankets to the floor and climbed down, her limbs stiff and clumsy. She did not look at him. She arranged her bedroll as far from his bed as the hearth would allow. It felt thin and inadequate. Elias watched her, a knot in his stomach. He sighed, a rough sound. "That won't be enough." He stood, went to his own bed, and pulled off the heavy buffalo robe that served as his main covering. He tossed it to her. It was heavy, smelling of him, of smoke and pine, and something clean and male. "Take it," he said, before she could protest. "My bed is banked by the wall. I'll be warm enough." She wrapped the heavy hide around her, and the warmth, and his scent, was immediate. "Thank you." He merely grunted, climbing into his bed in his clothes and pulling a single, thinner wool blanket over himself. The tension in the cabin grew thick enough to choke on. They were acutely, painfully aware of each other. She could hear every breath he took, the rustle of his blankets when he shifted to ease his shoulder. He could see the shape of her, curled under his robe, her hair a dark spill on the bearskin. The wind screamed, and the fire crackled, and the silence between them was a heavy, loaded thing. On the third night of the storm, she began to cry out. It was not a loud sound. It was a low, desperate whimper, a sound of pure terror. "No," she breathed. "No, please, get off, please." Elias was awake instantly. The fire had burned down to red coals, and the cabin was steeped in shadows. He heard her thrashing on the rug, tangled in the heavy robe. "No," she said again, her voice breaking. I didn't." He was out of his bed in a moment, kneeling beside her. "Clara." He put his hand on her shoulder. She screamed, a short, sharp, terrified sound, and sat bolt upright, her eyes wide and blind with sleep, her hands coming up to fight him off. "Clara, it's me. It's Elias." He gripped her shoulders, his voice firm, trying to cut through the panic. "You're dreaming. You're here. You're safe." Her breath was coming in ragged, tearing sobs. The moonlight on the snow outside, amplified by the storm, cast a faint, ghostly light through the snow-caked window, just enough for him to see the terror on her face. He was," she stammered, shaking violently. "He had me, the ink." She collapsed against him, her fight gone, replaced by a shuddering wave of sobs. She buried her face in his shirt, her hands clutching his arms as if he were the only solid thing in the world. Elias froze. This was a territory more dangerous than any blizzard, any mountain lion. He was stiff, awkward, his own wounds aching, but he did not push her away. Hesitantly, he brought his good arm up, his large, rough hand settling between her shoulder blades. He just held her, his hand moving in a slow, clumsy circle. "You're all right," he murmured, his voice a low rumble. "It was a dream. You're in the cabin. You're safe." He repeated the words, over and over, like a mantra. "You're safe." Her sobs slowly quieted. The shaking eased. She did not pull away, but sagged against him, her forehead resting on his chest, her breathing still hitched. They sat like that for a long time, in the dark, with the storm raging outside. The only sound was the fire and the fading echo of her fear. "I killed him," she whispered. The words were so quiet he barely heard them. He stopped rubbing her back. He waited. "Back in Philadelphia," she said, her voice muffled against his shirt. "The man from my dream, Mr. Abernathy. I killed him." Elias said nothing. He just held her, listening. "My father lost everything. We were ruined. That man, he thought he could buy me. He thought because we were poor, I was available. He came to the house. He attacked me. He tore my dress." She pulled back just enough to look up, though her face was mostly shadow. I told the court. No one believed me. They said I was a seductress, a killer, looking for money." "What happened?" Elias asked, his voice still low. "I hit him." Her voice was flat now, devoid of tears. "He had me against the desk, and I grabbed the inkwell. It was heavy, glass. I hit him, and he fell, and he didn't get up. I didn't mean to kill him. I just wanted him to stop." She took a shaky breath. "But the dream is always the same, and I know if it happened again, I'd do it. I'd kill him again. If anyone." She trailed off, but the meaning was clear. Elias was silent. He thought of the man he had killed, Finch, the hot-blooded fight over cards, the glint of the blade. His had been a stupid, avoidable death. Hers was not. "You defended yourself," he said. It was not a question. It was a statement. "It doesn't matter. They didn't see it that way." "They were fools," he said. "Towns are full of them." He shifted, his wounded shoulder sending a sharp pain through his arm. Clara seemed to notice for the first time that she was clinging to him. She pulled away, embarrassed. "I'm sorry. I woke you." "It's all right." She sat on the rug, pulling the buffalo robe around her. He remained kneeling, a shadow between her and the fire. "You're not afraid of me?" she asked, her voice small. Elias almost laughed, a short, harsh sound. "Afraid of you? Clara, I watched you run at a mountain lion with a stick of kindling. I've known men, soldiers, who would have run the other way. You've got more grit than any 10 of them." He looked at his hands, then back at her. "You remind me of no one I've ever met," he said, the words coming slow, as if he were pulling them from a deep well. "You're honest. Even your fear is honest." He looked into the coals of the fire. "Maybe," he said, so quiet she had to lean forward to hear him. "Maybe you remind me of who I could have been, if I hadn't been so angry, if I hadn't run." She stared at him. This man of granite and silence was offering her a piece of his soul. He had not judged her. He had not recoiled. He had seen the ugliest part of her, and he had called her honest. He stood, his knees popping. "The fire's low. Go to sleep. Clara, you're safe here." He turned, added a log to the fire, and climbed back into his bed. But this time, when Clara lay down, she did not pull the robe up to her chin. She lay on her back, watching the new flames lick the wood, and listened to the sound of his breathing, just a few feet away. And for the first time in over a year, she did not feel hunted. The blizzard raged for another full day. The tension did not vanish after her confession, but it changed. It was no longer the sharp-edged tension of two strangers. It was a thick, humming awareness, a wire drawn taut. That night, the 4th of the storm, the woodpile was nearly gone. The cabin was cold again, the fire a sullen glow. Elias sat on his stool, carving a piece of wood, his bad arm resting in his lap. Clara was mending the same shirt she had been working on for days, her fingers stiff. She finished her work, folding the shirt. She looked at him. He was intent on his carving, his brow furrowed. The firelight carved deep lines into his face, highlighting the scar on his cheek, the hard line of his jaw. He was not a handsome man, not in the way of the men she had known, but his face had a raw, elemental power. It was a face that had seen things and endured them. She stood up. She did not go to her bedroll. She walked the 2 steps to the hearth and stood beside him. He stopped carving. He did not look up, but he was utterly still. He waited. Clara's heart was a hammer in her chest. She was terrified. Not of him, but of what she was about to do. But she was more tired of being afraid than she was of being cold. She had run from whispers, from judgment, from the memory of a dead man. She was done running. Slowly, she reached out her hand. Her fingers trembled. She laid them on his cheek. His skin was rough, calloused, but warm from the fire. He closed his eyes at her touch. She leaned down. He did not move, did not meet her halfway. This had to be her choice. She kissed him. It was hesitant at first. Her lips were cold, and they met his with a trembling uncertainty. It was a question. For a long moment, he was as still as stone. Then, he let out a long, slow breath, a sigh that seemed to come from the deepest part of him. He dropped the knife and the piece of wood. His good hand, his right hand, came up and tangled in her hair, holding her fast. His other hand, the left, came up to cup her jaw, his grip clumsy with the bandage but fierce. He kissed her back, and it was no longer hesitant. It was a deluge. It was all the loneliness, the silence, the shared danger, the night spent listening to each other breathe in the dark. It was the hunger of a man who had been alone for 5 years and the desperation of a woman who had never been truly seen. It was rough and deep, and tasted of whiskey and wood smoke and the salt of her skin. It was not gentle. It was a claiming. He pulled her onto his lap, his hand never leaving her hair, his mouth never leaving hers. She clung to him, her hands moving from his face to his shoulders, gripping the rough wool of his shirt. It was a drowning, and he was the only solid ground. When they finally broke for air, they were both breathing hard. He rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. "Clara," he breathed, his voice raw. She didn't speak. She just kissed him again, this time with a slow, deliberate tenderness that was more profound than the fire that had preceded it. He lifted her. She weighed nothing. He carried her the few steps to his bed, the one built into the wall, and laid her down on the straw mattress. The blizzard screamed outside, but in the small, curtained space, there was only the sound of their breathing and the hammering of their hearts. He did not blow out the lamp. He wanted to see her. He undressed her slowly, his rough hands surprisingly gentle as he unbuttoned her worn flannel shirt. As he untied the laces of her chemise, he looked at her not with hunger, but with a kind of reverence, as if she were something precious he had found in the snow. She, in turn, unlaced his shirt, pushing the bloody, torn fabric off his wounded shoulder. She saw the ugly gashes from the lion, and beneath them, the old, pale lines of scars that covered his back, the ones she had seen from the window. She traced one with her finger, and he flinched, not from pain, but from the memory. She laid her hand flat on his back. "It's all right," she whispered, echoing his words to her. He undressed himself, his own scars laid bare in the lamplight. They lay facing each other, two people defined by the marks left on them, inside and out. He made love to her slowly. It was not the desperate fumbling she had feared, nor the passion of their kiss. It was a deliberate, almost solemn act. It was a release, a slow unburdening. It was his silence meeting her fear, and for a long, quiet time, both were banished. He held her, his body solid and warm, and brought her to a release so powerful it felt like a breaking, a shattering of the ice that had encased her heart for so long. She cried out, a soft sound, and he held her tighter, burying his face in her hair as his own release came. Afterward, they lay tangled together, the buffalo robe pulled over them. The cabin was almost warm. Elias held her, his hand stroking her hair. He felt a stillness in his soul, a quiet he had not known since before the fight with Finch. He had pulled this woman from the snow, but he felt as if she had just pulled him from a deeper, colder drift. He pressed a kiss to her temple. "You're safe now," he whispered, his voice thick. "You're safe now, with me. Clara heard the words. She heard the vow in them, part of her. The part that was warm and aching and held fast in his arms. Wanted to believe it, but the other part, the part that had sat in a courtroom and fled across a continent, recoiled. Safety was a lie. It was a word men used before they hurt you. She didn't answer. She just turned her face into his chest, her eyes wide open in the dark, unsure if she had just found salvation or a new, more complicated kind of ruin. The blizzard broke the next morning. The wind died, and a weak, watery sun lit a world of impossible, blinding white. The snow was piled in drifts 10 feet high, sculptural and beautiful and deadly. Clara woke before Elias. She slid from the bed, the cold air hitting her skin. She dressed quickly, her movements stiff. His words from the night before echoed in her head. "You're safe now." They felt like a chain. She looked at him, asleep. His face, in repose, was younger. The hard lines softened. His bandaged shoulder was stark against the dark blankets. She felt a wave of tenderness so strong it frightened her. She had let him in. She had let him see her. And now, she would destroy him. She was poison. She had brought ruin to her father. She had brought death to Mr. Abernathy. She had been on this mountain less than a month, and she had nearly gotten Elias killed by a lion. And now she had tied him to her. She looked around the cabin. It was his sanctuary, the place he had built to be free of the world, of men like Finch, and she had invaded it. When her past came, and it would find him, too, she could not bear that. She moved with grim purpose. Her bag was small. It took less than a minute to pack her few things. She laced her boots, her hands shaking. She looked at the buffalo robe on the bed. She left it. She pulled on her coat. She did not know where she would go. Back to the settlement. Maybe, or just walk. It didn't matter. She just had to go. She quietly, slowly lifted the bar on the door. It groaned in the frozen silence. She winced, looking back. Elias didn't stir. She slipped out, pulling the heavy door shut behind her. The cold was a physical blow. The bright sun on the snow was blinding. She waded through the deep drift in the clearing, her breath pluming. She made it to the tree line, to the beginning of the trail that was now just a depression in the snow. "Going somewhere?" The voice was low, and it was right behind her. Clara spun around. Elias was standing there. He was in his shirt sleeves, his feet bare in the snow, his rifle held loosely in his good hand. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the trail. "You'll die before you make it a mile," he said, his voice flat. "The drifts are over your head." "I have to go," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I can't stay here." "Because of last night?" "Because of everything!" she cried, the words bursting out of her. "Don't you see? I'm ruined. I killed a man. I nearly got you killed. I can't destroy your life too." He finally looked at her. His eyes were not angry. They were clear and sharp, and they saw right through her. "My life?" he said, scoffing. "What life? Trapping coons and talking to myself? Hiding from a ghost? That's not a life. Clara, that's a long wait for the end." "You were safe," she insisted. "You were free of it all. And I brought it here. I brought the blood and the trouble. If I stay, more will come. It always does." He took a step closer, his bare feet sinking deep into the snow. He didn't seem to notice the cold. "You told me you killed a man who put his hands on you. I told you I killed a man over a card game, between the two of us. I'd say your hands are cleaner. That's not the point." "Then what is?" he demanded, his voice rising. "That you're going to run? You're going to walk into that snow and die just so I can go back to being safe? You think that's what I want?" "I can't destroy you. Elias, I won't!" He was in front of her now, so close she could see the ice forming in his beard. He reached out and grabbed her arm, his grip just short of painful. You don't get to make that choice for me, he said, his voice a low, fierce growl. You say you're ruin? You say you'll destroy my life? He leaned in, his gaze burning into hers. Then let me decide if it's worth destroying. Clara stared at him. The words hit her harder than Abernathy's fist, harder than the judge's gavel. He was not turning her away. He was not afraid. He was taking her, ruin and all, and calling it his own choice. The dam broke, the terror, the shame, the years of running, the hopeless, aching loneliness. It all came apart. She fell. She did not faint, but her legs gave out, and she collapsed in the snow, her sobs tearing out of her, raw and animal. Elias did not let her fall. He caught her, pulling her up against him, his good arm wrapping around her like a steel band. He held her as she wept, his face buried in her hair, his bare feet planted in the snow. You're not leaving, he muttered into her hair. I'm not letting you go. She clung to him, her hands fisted in his shirt, her tears freezing on his skin. He held her until the sobs quieted, until she was just shuddering against him in the bright, cold morning. All right, she whispered, her voice broken. All right, I'll stay. She pulled back, wiping her face with her frozen glove. For now, Elias nodded, his expression grim, but satisfied. For now is good. He looked down at his feet, as if noticing them for the first time. Now, let's get inside, before my toes fall off. He kept his arm around her, and together, they turned their backs on the trail and waded through the deep snow, back to the cabin. The cabin, once a box of cold and tension, had softened. Its corners seemed to have warmed, the shadows in the rafters receding. After the blizzard, the world outside was a deep, frozen white, but inside, a new life was taking root. It began with sound. Clara had started to hum. It was a quiet, almost unconscious sound, a broken melody that she hummed while stirring the stew or mending the tears in their clothes. The first time Elias heard it, he stopped, his hand halfway to the woodpile. He had lived in silence for 5 years, surrounded only by the wind and the crack of his axe, the sound of her humming, small and fragile in the vast, cold wilderness, was a strange, sharp ache in his chest. It was the sound of a home, a sound he had long since buried. He said nothing, but he found himself pausing his work just to listen. In return, he gave her a bed. The loft was too cold, too far. The floor was an indignity. One morning, he went out, his bad shoulder still stiff, and spent the entire day in the frozen air, sawing and hewing at pine logs he had felled before the storm. He worked with a focused, quiet intensity. Clara watched him from the window, his breath pluming, the set of his jaw firm. He was building something. That night, he dragged the pieces in, one by one, his face flushed with the cold and the effort. He assembled them in the corner opposite his own bunk, near the hearth. He used no nails, only pegs and tightly cut notches, the way a man builds something to last. He worked by firelight, his large hands surprisingly deft. When he was done, he laid a mattress of fresh, fragrant pine boughs on the frame, and over that, the bearskin rug she had been sleeping on. It was a proper bunk, solid, safe, and warm. Clara stood by the table, her hands twisted in her apron, speechless. It was the first gift she had ever received that asked for nothing in return. It's a bed, she said, her voice small. Elias shrugged, rubbing his sore shoulder. The loft is too cold, and I'm tired of you being on the floor. He turned away, pretending to busy himself with the fire, his face averted, uncomfortable with the sudden, sharp swell of emotion in the room. She did not thank him. She simply walked over, her hand tracing the smooth, axe-hewn wood of the frame. That night, she slept in it, and for the first time, she felt she truly belonged inside those 4 walls. The intimacy between them grew, as steady and slow as the meltwater that now began to drip from the eaves on sunny afternoons. The raw, desperate passion of the blizzard night had settled into a kind of deep, quiet knowing. They were no longer just two people surviving. They were partners. They chopped wood together. He would swing the heavy axe, splitting the big rounds, and she would follow with the smaller hatchet, splitting the pieces into kindling and stacking it. The work was hard, her muscles burning, but she felt a fierce pride in it. One afternoon, he split a particularly knotty piece of pine, the axe blade sinking deep and getting stuck. He grunted, trying to wrench it free. Damnation, stuck fast. Clara watched him. You should try wiggling it, she offered. He shot her a look, his brow furrowed. Wiggling it? That's what my father's gardener used to say. Wiggle it. Don't force it. Elias stared at her. Then a strange, rusty sound rumbled in his chest. It was a laugh. He had not laughed in years, and the sound was awkward, stiff, but it was real. Wiggle it, he repeated, trying the word out. He gave the handle a sharp twist, and the blade came free. Well, I'll be... He looked at her, and she was smiling, her cheeks pink from the cold. He stopped smiling, but the warmth remained in his eyes. He reached out, his glove rough, and wiped a speck of sawdust from her cheek. His thumb lingered for a moment. You're a strange woman, Clara Boone, he said, his voice low. And you're a stubborn one. Elias Carver, she replied, her voice soft. He leaned in and kissed her, there in the snow, surrounded by wood chips. It was not the desperate, frantic kiss of the storm. It was slow and sure, and tasted of pine and cold air. It was new, and it was ancient. It was a kiss that said, "You are mine." The quiet evenings took on a new shape. After their meal, they would sit by the fire. She would mend, and he would carve. He told her he was mending a trap latch, or carving a new handle for his knife. But he angled his body away from her, hiding the small piece of wood in his large hand. She would watch him from under her lashes. He was carving something small and fine. He was using a piece of pale, smooth aspen, and he worked with a patient, focused care, his brow furrowed. He was making a pendant. She could see the rough shape of it, a bird, maybe, with its wings spread. He kept it tucked in his pocket, wrapped in a small piece of leather. When he thought she was asleep, he would take it out and work on it by the last light of the coals, his face tender in the glow. Clara would lie in her new bunk, her back to him, and pretend to be asleep, her heart aching with a feeling so new and sharp she did not have a name for it. It felt dangerously like joy. The outside world returned on a Tuesday, a month after the great blizzard. The snow had begun to melt on the south-facing slopes, and the trail was a treacherous mix of mud and ice, but passable. The sound came first, not the familiar crack of a branch or the scurry of a marten. It was the jingle of a bridle, the suck of a horseshoe pulling from mud. Elias was at the door in an instant, his rifle in his hand. Clara's heart seized, the blood draining from her face. "Get in the loft," he said, his voice low and hard. "And be silent. Do not move, no matter what you hear." Elias. "Now, Clara." She scrambled up the ladder, pulling it up after her. She lay flat on the rough boards, peering through a crack between two logs. A man on horseback emerged from the trees. He was not a mountain man. He was dressed in a dark wool coat, a town hat, and he rode a fine-looking sorrel with a white blaze on its face. He had a pistol belted high on his waist and a repeating rifle in a scabbard. He stopped in the clearing, his eyes scanning the cabin, the woodpile, the hide-covered smoking rack. Elias stepped out onto the porch, his own rifle held casually, but pointed at the ground near the stranger's horse. "That's far enough." The man smiled, a thin, unpleasant expression. He held his hands up, away from his pistol. Easy, friend. Just looking for information. Name's Harlan. Looking for a man named Carver. You found him. Good, good. Harlan's eyes were quick, taking in Elias's patched coat, his bad shoulder, his stoic, unwelcoming face. Tough winter. It's always a tough winter. Elias said, "What do you want?" I'm a private agent, you might say, from back east, looking for a fugitive. Harlan reached into his coat pocket, moving slowly. Elias's thumb moved to the hammer of his rifle. The man pulled out a folded piece of paper, looking for a woman. Name of Clara Boone, or maybe she's using another name. Pretty, dark hair, thin, about this high. Elias stared at him, his face granite. Never heard of her. You sure? Harlan smiled again. She was seen heading west. A woman like that, she'd seek out protection, maybe find a man, a solitary man. There's no one here but me, Elias said, his voice flat. Hasn't been for 5 years. I don't get visitors, and I don't like them. You should move on. Harlan's smile faded. There's a reward, $500, for her capture, dead or alive, for the murder of a prominent citizen in Philadelphia. Elias did not blink. $500, that's a lot of money. It is. And a long way to come for it. The family wants justice, Harlan said. From the loft, Clara felt the blood freeze in her veins. She was peering at the horse, the sorrel, the white blaze. She knew that horse. It had belonged to a cousin of the local sheriff, a smug, cruel man named Davis, who was a close friend of the Abernathy family. He had been at the trial, staring at her, his eyes full of contempt. This wasn't just the law. This was a manhunt. This was a private vendetta, paid for with Abernathy's blood money. Well, Elias said, I can't help you. Now, get off my land. The trail's bad. You'll want to make it to the settlement before dark. Harlan stared at Elias, a long, assessing look. He looked at the cabin, his gaze lingering on the single window. He looked at the smoke rising from the chimney. Just you say? Seems a lonely life. I like it that way. I'm sure you do. Harlan gathered his reins. I'll be in the settlement for a few days, asking around. If you happen to remember anything, that's $500. Friend, easy money. He turned the sorrel, his gaze sweeping the clearing one last time, and urged the horse back down the muddy trail. Elias did not move until the sound of the hooves had faded completely. He stood on the porch for another full minute, his rifle at the ready. Finally, he came inside, barring the door. He looked up at the loft. He's gone. Clara dropped the ladder and climbed down, her legs shaking so badly she almost fell. She collapsed onto the stool. It's all right, Elias said, his voice hard. He's gone. No, she whispered, her eyes wide with a terror he had not seen since the night of her dream. No, you don't understand. That horse, the sorrel, I know that horse. Elias stopped, his hand on the rifle. What do you mean? It belonged to a man named Davis, the sheriff's cousin, back home. He was a friend of Abernathy. He was at the trial. He looked at me. She shuddered, wrapping her arms around herself. Elias's face darkened. He put the pieces together. This isn't a territorial marshal. This is a bounty hunter, hired. They hired him, she whispered, the reality crashing down on her. Abernathy's family, they want me dead or alive. He said, they don't want justice, they want revenge. The softness of the last few weeks evaporated, the joy turning to ash. The cabin was a trap. Elias was in danger. She had done exactly what she had feared. She had brought her past to his door. That night was a torment. Elias tried to reassure her. He sat with her, holding her hand, his grip tight. He's one man. He doesn't know you're here. He's fishing. He'll leave. He won't, she said, her voice dead. He has the sheriff's cousin's horse. They know. They must have tracked me. From Omaha, from Cheyenne. They know I came west. Then we'll fight him. He said dead or alive, she choked out. $500. Men will do anything for that much money. He'll go to the settlement. He'll find those men who saw me, the ones who told me you were up here. He'll offer them a share. They'll come back. All of them. Elias's jaw set. She was right. The men in the saloon would sell their own mothers for a fraction of that. He held her. Let them come. This is my mountain. I know the ground. But his words were hollow. Even to him, he was one man with a bad shoulder. He couldn't fight off a whole town. She said nothing more. She let him hold her, let him bank the fire, and let him kiss her good night. She lay in her new bunk, staring into the darkness, her body rigid. She waited. She waited for hours, until the rhythm of his breathing deepened, until she was sure he was in the deepest part of sleep. The moon was high, casting a pale light into the cabin. She rose like a ghost. She did not light a lamp. Her movements were sure. Quiet. She packed her small bag, her spare stockings, the bar of soap. She pulled on her boots, her coat. She went to the table. She found a piece of charcoal from the hearth. On the back of an old bill of lading for traps, she wrote. Her hand did not shake. Elias, you were right. I am ruin. I'm sorry. They are coming for me, not you. Do not follow me. Tell them I fled north. Tell them I stole your food and ran. They will believe you. Live your life. You saved me. I will not be the end of you. Clara. She left the note on the table, weighed down by the tin of pine tar salve. She looked at him one last time. He was asleep, his face turned toward her empty bunk. Her heart broke. She put her gloved hand to her mouth, stifling a sob. Then she turned. She quietly, carefully lifted the bar on the door and slipped out into the frozen night. She did not go to the trail. They would expect that. She went west, toward the river, a fast-flowing, shallow artery that marked the edge of his trapping territory. It was frozen in parts, but running fast in the center. If she could cross it, she could lose herself in the deep, untracked wilderness on the other side. She could go north, to British territory, or she could just disappear. The moon was bright on the snow, and the going was fast. The river was 2 miles away. She ran, stumbling in the drifts, her lungs burning. The note she had left a hot coal in her memory. She reached the riverbank. It was a dark, rushing ribbon in the white landscape. Patches of ice clung to the banks, but the center was a torrent of black water. It was impossibly cold. It would kill her. She stood, hesitating, her breath tearing at her. Die here, or die on a gallows back east, or worse, get Elias killed. You're a damn fool, Clara. The voice came from the trees behind her. She spun, her heart leaping into her throat. Elias was standing 10 feet away. He was not in his shirt sleeves. He was fully dressed, wearing his heavy coat, his rifle in one hand, and her own small carpet bag in the other, which he must have grabbed on his way out. How did you... You think I'd sleep? He said, his voice a low, cold fury. Tonight, I heard you lift the latch. I was waiting. Elias, you have to let me go, she pleaded, taking a step back, toward the icy water. They're coming. That man. He'll bring others. I know. They will hang me, and they will kill you for helping me. You have to tell them I ran off. You have to save yourself. And you think this is saving me? He yelled, his voice echoing in the cold night air. Leaving a note and walking into a river. You think I'm just going to go back to that cabin, read your letter, and go back to trapping? Is that what you think of me? You don't understand. No, you don't understand. He strode forward, closing the distance between them. He grabbed her arm, his grip like a trap. You don't get to do this. You don't get to decide for me. I already told you that. But I can't... We, he said, his voice fierce, cutting her off. It's we now. You don't get to be alone in this anymore. He was furious, but his eyes were full of a desperate, terrified plea. He was afraid of losing her. I have to run, she whispered, the fight draining out of her. It's the only way. Fine, he said, his grip on her arm tightening. Then where are we going? North, to the Tetons? If you run, I go with you. She stared at him, stunned. The cold, the bounty, the river, it all faded. What? No, Elias, you can't. Your life, your cabin, everything you built. It's just wood, he said, shaking her slightly. It's just a place. I was hiding here. Clara, same as you. Hiding from a ghost. I'm done hiding. You don't owe me that, she whispered, the tears finally coming, hot on her cold cheeks. You don't owe me your life. He let go of her arm, but only to put his hands on her shoulders. He looked down at her, his face lit by the moon, and all the anger was gone. I know, he said, his voice rough. I'm not doing it because I owe you. I'm doing it because I want to. He pulled her against him, his arms wrapping around her, crushing her to his chest. I'm not letting you go. We stay and fight, or we run, but we do it together. She burrowed her face into his cold coat, her hands fisting in the fabric. I'm so scared. She wept. I know, he murmured into her hair. So am I. He held her for a long time, on the bank of the frozen river. Finally, he pulled back. He took her small bag from his hand and shoved it back into hers. Let's go back, he said. We have work to do. They walked back to the cabin, side by side, their shoulders brushing. The moon was setting, and the sky in the east was a pale, cold gray. When they entered the cabin, Elias barred the door. He turned and saw her note on the table. He picked it up. He read it, his expression grim. Then he looked at her. Where is it? He asked. Where is what? The poster. Harlan, did he give it to you? No, she said. He just showed it. He lied. Elias said. He reached into his own coat pocket. He must have dropped this when he was pulling out his tobacco. Or maybe I took it. I don't recall. He tossed the folded paper onto the table. It was the wanted poster. Clara's hand trembled as she picked it up and unfolded it. She saw her own name, Clara Boone. She saw the words, wanted for murder. And she saw the sum, $500. Her face, drawn from a sketch, looked back at her, a pale, haunted stranger. She looked at Elias. He was watching her, his face hard. He nodded once, toward the stove. Clara walked to the cast-iron stove, lifted the grate, and fed the poster to the low, glowing coals. The paper flared, the edges curling to black. Her name, the money, the lie. It all turned to smoke and ash. She watched until it was gone. When she turned back, the softness was gone from Elias's face. The man who humored her jokes and carved her a secret gift was gone. In his place was the man who had survived a knife fight, who had fought a mountain lion, who had built a life on this ridge with nothing but his own hands. He went to the wall and took down his rifle. He began to check the action, his movements economical and precise. He'll be back, Elias said, his voice flat, and he'll bring friends. He went to the heavy wooden chest under his bunk and pulled it out. Inside were boxes of cartridges, tins of powder, and several long, wicked-looking skinning knives. He laid them on the table. He pulled out a heavy Colt pistol, the metal gleaming dully. You said you'd kill him again, he said, not looking at her. You said you'd defend yourself. I would, she said, her voice steady. Good. He pushed the rifle and a box of cartridges across the table to her. Because you're going to have to... He began to check the action on the pistol, his eyes cold and clear. He's not taking you. We're not running. This is my mountain, and they're not welcome on it. They did not have to wait long. 3 days. 3 days of a shared grim silence. The cabin was no longer a home. It was a fortress. Elias spent the time reinforcing the door, banking the window with firewood, and drilling small, new holes in the log walls, just wide enough for a rifle barrel. Clara cleaned the rifles, measured out powder, and counted cartridges, her movements economical and precise. They ate cold biscuits and jerky, their ears tuned to the sound of the trail. The softness that had grown between them was still there, but it was overlaid with a new, hard layer of shared purpose. They came on the 4th morning, just after dawn. The air was bitingly cold, the sky a flat gray sheet. Elias, who had been watching from a high rock, slipped back into the cabin. His face was like stone. "They're here," he said, his voice flat. Clara's heart, which had been hammering for 72 hours, gave a painful lurch. "How many?" "4, he said, picking up his rifle and moving to the door. "Harlan, the one from before, and 3 others. They look like saloon sweepings, drunk, or close to it. They're loud." He was right. They were arrogant. They rode into the clearing bunched together, not fanned out like men expecting a fight. They were loud, laughing at some crude joke, eager for the $500 Harlan had promised them from the settlement. They underestimated the man on the mountain. They saw a lone trapper, probably scared, and a woman who was easy money. They didn't see a man defending his home, or a woman who had already learned how to kill. Harlan, the leader, dismounted. The other 3, a thick man with a greasy beard, a skinny youth, and a hard-faced man with a shotgun, stayed on their horses, their arrogance plain. "Carver!" Harlan yelled, his voice thin in the cold. He had his pistol in his hand. "We know she's in there. We had a nice chat with your friends down in the settlement. They remembered seeing her." Elias stood behind the heavy plank door, his rifle aimed through the small peephole. Clara was at the window, her own rifle on the sill, her breath pluming in the cold air of the cabin. $500! Carver! Harlan shouted. "We'll even give you 50 of it for your trouble. Just send the girl out, and we'll leave you be." "This is my land," Elias yelled back, his voice a low boom that carried in the dense air. "You're not welcome here. Turn around and leave." The man with the greasy beard laughed, a wet, ugly sound. "He's protecting his whore. Must be a cold winter. Mountain man, if you're keeping that murdering bitch warm." Harlan smiled, a thin, reptilian expression. "Last chance. Carver, we don't want to kill you, but the poster says dead or alive. That applies to her. It can just as easy apply to you." "Go to hell," Elias said. Harlan sighed, as if bored by the entire affair. "All right, you had your chance." He looked at the hard-faced man. "Cole, burn him out. Smoke the rats from the hole." The man named Cole grunted. He dismounted, pulling a flask of oil and a bundle of rags from his saddlebag. He began walking toward the woodpile, just under the cabin's eaves. He was arrogant, his shotgun held loosely, not expecting a response. He never made it. Elias fired. The shot was a single, deafening crack that echoed off the ridge. It was not a warning. The man named Cole seemed to stumble, his hands flying to his chest. He looked down, surprised, at the dark, spreading stain. He dropped the rags and crumpled into the snow. Elias had drawn first blood. For a heartbeat, the clearing was silent. Then, all hell broke loose. "He got Cole!" the skinny youth screamed. The 2 remaining riders scrambled, spurring their horses and firing wildly at the cabin. Bullets thudded into the heavy logs, sending chips of wood flying. "Get him! Kill him!" Clara, her hands shaking, lined up her sights on the man with the greasy beard. She pulled the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, the recoil a painful jolt. The shot went wide, kicking up a plume of snow near his horse's feet. The horse reared, screaming with terror, and the man fought to control it, cursing her. "Away from the window!" Elias yelled, grabbing her by the shoulder and pulling her back. A bullet sang through the space where her head had been, shattering a tin cup on the shelf behind her. "Get low, by the hearth!" Harlan was smarter than his men. He wasn't firing wildly. He had dismounted, using his horse for cover, and was moving deliberately toward the side of the cabin, toward the blind spot. The greasy-bearded man, having calmed his horse, was firing from the saddle, keeping them pinned. The skinny youth had leaped from his own horse and was running for the cover of the trees, firing his pistol as he went. "He's flanking us!" Elias moved to the back wall. Peering through a chink, he saw the youth duck behind a large pine. "Stay down. Clara, reload." He aimed his rifle at the pine tree, waiting. The youth leaned out to fire. Elias shot. The man cried out, a high, sharp sound of pain, and his pistol spun into the snow. The return fire from that direction stopped. "One down, one wounded." Elias panted. He looked back toward the front. The greasy-bearded man was still firing. "Where's Harlan?" "Crash!" The sound came from the window. Harlan, under the cover of his man's firing, had smashed the wooden shutter and the glass with the butt of his rifle. He was halfway through the opening, his face a mask of rage and effort. Elias spun, raising his rifle, but Harlan was too fast. He fired his pistol from his hip. The shot went wild, the bullet burying itself in the heavy ceiling beam above Elias's head. But it was enough. It forced Elias to dive for cover behind the heavy pine table, which overturned with a crash. Harlan tumbled into the room, rolling to his feet, his pistol up. He saw Elias scrambling behind the table. He saw Clara. She was huddled by the hearth, her rifle on the floor where she dropped it in the confusion. She was defenseless. Harlan smiled, his teeth bared. "There you are, pretty bird. You're worth $500. He advanced on her, keeping his body between her and the overturned table. Elias was trapped. "Don't move, Carver," Harlan snarled. "Or the girl gets it, right in her pretty, lying face." Clara looked up, her body frozen, her mind screaming. This was it. This was the study. This was Abernathy. His face flushed with wine, his hands grabbing. It was the same smell of sweat and entitlement, the same predator's eyes. "Get up!" Harlan growled. He grabbed her by the hair, yanking her brutally to her feet. She cried out, a thin, desperate sound. "You've caused me a hell of a lot of trouble, bitch. Got my man Cole killed." "He attacked me," Clara whispered. The old words, the useless defense that no one had believed. "I don't care what you say." Harlan laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. He pressed the cold, round barrel of his pistol to her temple, the metal biting into her skin. "You're coming back with me. I'm going to chain you to my saddle. And if you give me one bit of trouble on the ride, I'll use you till you beg me to kill you. You'll wish you'd never left Philadelphia." He was dragging her toward the door, using her as a human shield against Elias. "Please," she begged, stumbling. "Shut your mouth." Something in Clara broke. It was not her spirit. It was the chain, the fear, the running, the lifetime of being prey, of being whispered about, of being judged and hunted. It all burned away, replaced by a cold, sharp, clarifying rage. She was not the girl in the study. She was the woman who had survived the wilderness. She was the woman who had fought a mountain lion in the dark. Her hand, which had been clutching at her waist, touched the heavy, long-bladed skinning knife Elias had given her, the one she had tucked into her belt that morning. She stopped begging. Her body went still. "I'm not going back," she said, her voice clear and low. "You don't have a choice." Harlan began to sneer. She moved. She did not scream. She did not hesitate. She twisted, her body moving with a speed born of pure, primal instinct. She drove the knife up, under his ribs, with all her strength, pushing it toward his heart. Harlan stopped. His body went rigid. He looked down at the handle protruding from his dark coat. his eyes wide with the same stupid, slack-jawed surprise she had seen on Abernathy's face. He gasped, a wet, bubbling sound. His pistol hand, the one pressed to her head, went limp. The gun clattered to the floor. Clara shoved him away from her, breaking his grip on her hair. He staggered back, his hands clutching the knife in his chest. He looked at her, his mouth opening and closing. No sound came out. Elias was already moving. He was up, vaulting over the table, his rifle leveled. But it wasn't needed. Harlan looked at Clara, his eyes full of a terrible, final confusion. "Bitch," he gurgled. He crumpled, falling face first onto the bearskin rug, and was still. The silence in the cabin was total, heavier and more profound than any blizzard. It was broken only by the sound of Clara's ragged, tearing breaths. Elias did not go to her. He stepped over Harlan's body, grabbed him by the collar, and checked his pulse. Nothing. He moved past him to the door, his rifle ready. "Stay here," he said, his voice hard. He moved out into the clearing. The man with the greasy beard was gone. His horse was gone. He had fled at the sound of the fight inside. The skinny youth in the trees was also gone. Elias followed a trail of blood drops in the snow for 50 yards before it disappeared into the thick timber. He was wounded and running. Elias walked over to the first man. Cole. He was dead, his eyes staring blankly at the gray sky. 2 men dead, 2 fled. The attack was over. He returned to the cabin. Clara had not moved. She was standing over Harlan's body, staring down at him. The knife was still embedded in his chest. She was looking at her hands. They were covered in his blood. "It's done," Elias said, his voice quiet as he barred the door. "The other 2 ran. They won't be back." Clara looked up, her eyes hollow, unfocused. I killed him." "You did," Elias said. He did not flinch. He went to the water basin, soaked a clean rag, and came back to her. He stood in front of her, gently. He took her hands in his. They were shaking violently. He began to wipe the blood from her palms, from her fingers, his touch methodical and sure. "You defended yourself, Clara," he said, his voice low and firm. "You defended us. There's no shame in it. There's no sin in it." She looked at the body, then at his face. She nodded once, a sharp, jerky motion. Then she turned, her hand flying to her mouth. She stumbled to the water bucket by the door and was violently sick, her body convulsing. Elias was there in an instant. He held her hair back from her face, his other hand a solid, warm presence on the small of her back as she retched, the violence of the act purging the violence she had just committed. He said nothing. He just held her, steadying her, until the shaking stopped and she was just gasping for air. When she was finished, he dipped a tin cup into the clean water bucket and handed it to her. "Rinse your mouth." She did, her hands trembling. She looked at him, her eyes still hollow, but a flicker of life returning. This is what I am. I bring death." "You brought a fight to my door," he corrected, his voice rough. "And you helped me win it. You're a survivor, Clara." He looked at the body on his floor. "Now, we have work to do before dark. It's not good to leave them out." The task was grim. The ground was frozen solid. The topsoil as hard as iron. Digging a grave was impossible. Together, in a cold, wordless ritual. They dragged Harlan's body out of the cabin. They dragged Cole's body from the woodpile. They brought them to a deep, rocky ravine about 200 yards from the cabin, a place where the snow had drifted deep, a place the wolves already knew. It was not a burial. It was a disposal. It was the unwritten law of the mountain. They rolled the bodies into the ravine, and they did not look down. They covered the spot with heavy, fallen branches and large rocks, a grim, makeshift cairn. They left them to the wilderness. They walked back to the cabin. The sun was setting, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of blood orange and deep, bruised purple. The air was deathly still. Elias scrubbed the floorboards where Harlan had fallen, the harsh lye soap stinging his hands. Clara cleaned her knife, her movements mechanical, over and over, until the blade gleamed. As dusk fell, they sat at the table. The cabin was clean, but it smelled faintly of lye and the cold, coppery tang of iron. The lamp was lit, casting a small, warm circle in the growing dark. They were exhausted, the adrenaline gone, leaving a deep, hollow ache in their bones. Clara stared at her hands. They were clean, red and raw from the lye, but she could still feel the phantom stickiness of the blood, still feel the horrible sensation of the blade sinking home. "They'll be back," she said, her voice flat. "Dead. The two that got away, the one with the beard, and the wounded one. They'll go to the settlement. They'll tell them we're murderers. They'll get the real sheriff." Elias was loading his rifle, checking the action again from pure habit. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe they'll just keep running. They're cowards. They lost their leader and their nerve. They might not say a word." "It doesn't matter." She looked up at him, and her eyes were no longer hollow. They were filled with a cold, hard clarity. "I'm tired of it. Elias." He stopped, looking at her. "I'm so tired of running," she said, her voice low, but gaining strength. "I'm tired of waiting for the next Harlan, the next whisper. I'm tired of hiding in the shadows, waiting for my past to ride into the clearing." She stood up, pacing the small space between the hearth and the door. "I won't live like this, hiding up here, wondering when the next man will come, wondering when they'll come for you, just because you are kind to me. I won't do it." Elias watched her, his face quiet in the lamplight. He had seen her terror and her grit. This was new. This was resolve. "So we run," he said, his voice flat. "We go north, to British territory. I can pack us out by morning. We can be gone before they even know we've left." "No?" She stopped pacing and faced him. That's just a bigger cabin, a colder hiding place. That's still running." He frowned. "Then what, Clara? There's nothing else." "We build something," she said, her gaze steady and fierce. "Something that doesn't move, something that doesn't run." He didn't understand. "Build? What are you talking about?" "I killed Mr. Abernathy in self-defense," she said, her voice clear and hard as iron. "I killed that man Harlan today, in self-defense. I'm not a murderer. I'm not a fugitive. I'm a woman who was attacked, and I fought back." She stepped closer, placing her hands on the table. "That bounty hunter, he was hired by the Abernathy family. That's not the law. That's a private debt. That's a vendetta." "Clara, they have a poster," Elias argued, though he felt a strange, new hope rising in him. "They'll hang you on that alone." "And we have the bounty letter," she countered, her eyes bright. "The one you took from his pocket. It proves he was a bounty hunter, not a marshal. It proves he was here for money. We have his horse, the sorrel, the one I recognized. It proves this is a conspiracy, a hunt, not an arrest." "They won't listen," he said, but his voice was uncertain. "They will," she insisted. "We won't go to the settlement. We'll ride to the county seat, to Junction City. We'll go to a real judge. We'll tell him. I'll tell him everything. It's a risk. I know it's a risk. But it's not hiding. Elias, it's a fight, the right kind of fight." Elias was silent. He looked at the floor, at the clean boards. He thought of his own flight, 5 years ago. He'd run from a messy fight, let them call him a killer, and accepted it. He'd hidden here and called it peace. This woman, who had every reason in the world to run, was choosing to stand. She was braver than he had ever been. He stood up. He walked over to her, his heart pounding a slow, heavy beat. He put his hands on her shoulders. "They'll try to lock you up. They won't listen to a mountain man and a wanted woman." "You said you'd vouch for me." she whispered, her gaze locked on his. "You said you'd tell them." He looked into her eyes, seeing the steel there, the fire he had seen when she'd faced the lion. She was right. This was the only way. It was the only way to be free. "All right," he said, his voice firm. "We'll ride down. We'll ride to Junction City. It's 2 days. We'll find the judge. And I'll stand by you. Whatever happens." They left the next morning, just as the sun was touching the peaks. They took Harlan's horse, the fine sorrel, and Elias's mule. They packed light, ammunition, jerky, the heavy buffalo robe, and the bounty letter, wrapped carefully in oilcloth and tucked deep in Elias's shirt. He left the cabin door unbarred. He left his traps. He wasn't sure he was coming back. The ride down the mountain was slow, the trail a treacherous mix of mud and melting snow. They spoke little, the grim ghosts of the fight hanging behind them, the unknown risks of the town looming ahead. They camped that night in a high, rocky pass, under a stand of ancient pines. They built a small, smokeless fire and huddled under the robe, the pistol between them, taking turns on watch. The next day, the trail widened, the air growing warmer as they descended. They left the rock and pine, entering a high meadow, lush with new spring grass, a small, clear stream, free of ice, cut through it. "We should water the animals," Elias said, his voice rough, "and ourselves." He led the horse and mule to the bank. Clara knelt by the water's edge. The water was cold, tasting of stone and pine. As she cupped it to her mouth, she saw her reflection. She stopped, her hands frozen. She stared. The woman looking back at her was not the pale, haunted girl from Philadelphia, with her soft hands and frightened eyes. Her face was thin, yes, but it was browned by the sun and the high, cold wind. Her eyes were not afraid. They were clear and hard and calm. Her hair, which she had hacked short with a skinning knife weeks ago for practical reasons, was pulled back in a simple, rough knot. She looked strong. She looked like she belonged to herself. A single tear traced a clean line through the dust on her cheek. It was not a tear of fear or of sadness. It was a tear of release. The woman in the water was a survivor. She was the woman Elias saw. She wept silently, her shoulders shaking. Not in grief, in relief, the terrible, crushing fear that had been her companion for over a year. It was gone. She felt his presence beside her. He knelt, offering her a piece of clean cloth from his saddlebag. She took it, wiping her face. "It's all right to be scared," he said, his voice gentle. "I'm not," she whispered, looking back at her reflection. "That's the strange part. I'm not scared anymore. I don't recognize myself." Elias looked at her, then at the water. "I do," he said softly. He reached into the pocket of his coat, the one he always kept his carving in. He pulled something out, his large, rough hand fumbling. I found this," he said, his voice suddenly awkward, his gaze averted. "In your bag. That first week, after you came. It was broken. The hinge." He held out his calloused hand. In his palm was her tin locket. Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She had forgotten it. She had assumed it was lost in the snow, or left on the trail with her horse. He had polished the tin, scrubbing away the tarnish. The small, broken hinge had been carefully, cleverly mended with a tiny, hammered piece of copper wire. He had cleaned the glass over the photograph. The small, serious face of the boy looked up at them. You kept it?" she whispered. She reached out, her trembling fingers touching the locket. "You mended it." "Couldn't find a chain for it," he muttered, still not looking at her. I was carving one, from that piece of aspen wood, but I didn't get to finish it." She took the locket from him, her fingers brushing his palm. She looked at the small, mended object. Then, at his face, she saw the man who had fought for her, who had held her hair as she wept, who was risking his own life and freedom to ride to a judge for her. "You kept it," she said again, her voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. Elias finally met her gaze. His eyes were steady, his face serious. All the awkwardness was gone, replaced by a simple, profound truth. "Always," he answered. She closed her hand around the locket, the metal warm from his skin. She didn't need to say anything else. He stood up and offered her his hand. She took it, and he pulled her to her feet. "Junction City is a half-day's ride," he said, his voice back to its normal, rough timbre. She nodded, tucking the locket safely into the pocket of her shirt, laying her hand over it. "Then let's go." They mounted up and rode out of the high meadow, down toward the town, together. Junction City was not a town. It was a wound in the earth, a sprawling, muddy collection of raw lumber buildings, horse troughs and saloons, all sitting under a gray sky that promised more rain. It smelled of wet pine, manure, and the sharp, metallic tang of a distant smithy. But it was the county seat, and the 2-story brick courthouse looked as grand and imposing to Clara as any cathedral in Philadelphia. Elias walked beside her. He had insisted she ride the mule while he led Harlan Sorrell. His face was a mask of grim resolve, his eyes constantly scanning the boardwalks, the alleyways, the faces of the men who stopped to stare at them. They were a hard-looking pair. Elias, with his mountain man's coat, his scarred face, and the rifle held in the crook of his arm. Clara, in her men's trousers, her hair hacked short, her face stained with trail dust and the memory of the fight. They tied the animals to a hitching post, slick with rain. "This is it," Elias said, his voice low. He touched her arm, a brief, grounding gesture. "You don't have to say a word if you don't want to. I'll do the talking." Clara looked at the courthouse steps. She felt the old, cold dread rise in her throat, the memory of the polished, hostile courtroom back east. But she also felt the solid weight of the locket in her pocket, the one he had mended. She shook her head. "No, I started this. I'll finish it. I'm done hiding." His eyes softened, a brief flicker of pride. "All right, together." They walked up the steps, their boots loud on the wooden boards of the porch. The building was quiet, smelling of floor polish, old paper, and stale cigar smoke. A young clerk with spectacles and a nervous twitch looked up from a massive ledger. His eyes widened at the sight of Elias. Can I help you, mister?" "We're here to see Judge Thorne," Elias said. His voice, kept low, seemed to fill the small, high-ceilinged room. "The judge is hearing property disputes. He's very busy," the clerk stammered, his gaze flicking to the rifle. "You'll need to make an appointment." "We don't have time," Elias said, his voice flat. He leaned forward, just slightly. "You can tell him that Elias Carver is here. You can tell him I brought him a wanted murderer, or," he paused, "you can tell him I'm here to report 2 killings on my land. Either way, I think he'll want to see us." The clerk swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. He scrambled from his stool. "Yes, sir. Right away, sir." He vanished through a tall, dark wood door. They waited. The silence was heavy, broken only by the ticking of a large clock on the wall. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She could feel the stares of the few men waiting on the benches, their eyes filled with idle, cruel curiosity. The clerk reappeared, his face pale. "The judge he'll see you, now." Judge Alistair Thorne's chambers were dark, cluttered with stacks of books, maps, and geological surveys. The air was thick with smoke from a dying cigar. The judge himself was a man in his late 60s, with a face like a dried apple, a shock of white hair, and the most tired, intelligent eyes Clara had ever seen. He was not impressed. "Carver," he grunted, not standing. I told the sheriff if I ever saw you down here, it meant the mountains had fallen over. What's this nonsense about murder? It's not nonsense, Judge, Elias said. He did not sit, though the judge had waved a dismissive hand toward a chair. This is Miss Clara Boone. According to a poster, she's wanted for murder in Philadelphia. The judge's eyes snapped to Clara. He studied her, from her worn boots to her haunted face. Clara forced herself to meet his gaze. And you brought her to me, the judge said, his voice skeptical. Not to the sheriff, not in chains. You just walked in. You're either a fool, Carver, or you think I am. I think you're a fair man, Elias said, which is why we're here. Miss Boone is also the victim of an illegal bounty hunt, and he laid his rifle on the desk. I'm here to report a case of self-defense. He unbuttoned his coat and pulled the oilcloth packet from his shirt. He laid it on the desk, unfolding it carefully. He pushed the bounty letter, signed by Harlan, across the desk. This man, Harlan, came to my cabin 4 days ago. He offered me money for her. I refused. He came back yesterday, with 3 men hired from the settlement. They came armed. They tried to burn us out. The judge's expression did not change, but his eyes sharpened. He read the letter. We defended our home, Elias continued, his voice a low, steady monotone. This Harlan and one of his men, a man named Cole, are dead. We killed them. The other 2 fled. We left the bodies in a ravine on my land. We brought the man's horse. It's tied outside. We're here to turn ourselves in, or to be cleared. Your choice. Judge Thorne put the letter down. He looked at Clara. The silence was suffocating. A long way from Philadelphia. Miss Boone, he said, his voice not unkind. This poster says you killed a prominent man, a Mr. Abernathy. What do you have to say about that? Clara's throat was dry. She thought of the whispers. She thought of the sneering prosecutor. She looked at Elias, who stood like a pine tree beside her, solid and unmoving. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. He was a friend of my father's, Clara began, her voice hoarse. She cleared her throat. My father lost his fortune. We were destitute. Mr. Abernathy came to our home. He offered me protection. He said I simply had to be accommodating. When I refused, he attacked me. He tore my dress. He was going to... She stopped, unable to say the word. I hit him, she said, her voice stronger now, colder. I hit him with a glass inkwell from the desk. I was defending myself. He fell. He died. And the trial, the judge prompted, steepling his fingers. No one believed me, she whispered, the old shame washing over her. They called me a seductress, a liar. They said I was angry he had refused me. His family is rich, powerful. I knew they would find a way to hang me. So I ran. And you ran here, the judge said, to the cabin of a man known to avoid all human contact. I was looking for work, Clara said, lifting her chin. Not protection. I was just tired of running. The judge was silent for a full minute. He stared at the bounty letter. $500. That's more than a bounty. That's a vendetta. Harlan was a private agent, not a U.S. Marshal. He had no jurisdiction here, and his warrant. He tapped the poster. Is probably just as bought and paid for. He leaned back in his chair, the leather groaning. He looked at Elias. You've got your own ghosts. Carver, I remember the file on that fight on the Snake River. You ran too. I did, Elias said, his voice rough. I ran from a messy fight, and I let it shadow me for 5 years. I was wrong to... Miss Boone, she ran from an injustice. There's a difference. When Harlan came, she wanted to run again, to save me the trouble. But she stayed. She fought. I vouch for her. Judge, my life on it. What happened on my ridge was self-defense, and I believe what happened in Philadelphia was too." Judge Thorne sighed, rubbing his tired eyes. "You two are a matched pair of trouble. You've left 2 dead men on your mountain. You've brought this jurisdictional nightmare to my desk. And you look like hell, Miss Boone. Both of you." He rang a small bell. The nervous clerk reappeared. "Find Sarah Albright." The judge ordered, "Tell her I have a guest, someone who needs a room, a hot bath, and a decent meal, and a dress, something that fits. Put it on the county's dime." Clara looked at Elias, panicked. Was he separating them? "Go on, miss," the judge said, his voice gentle. "Mrs. Albright is a good woman. She'll take care of you. Get yourself cleaned up. I've got to send a wire to Philadelphia, and I've got to talk to Mr. Carver here about his own past. It seems we're clearing the docket today, one way or another." Elias met her gaze. "It's all right. Go." Clara hesitated, then turned and followed the clerk out, leaving Elias alone with the judge. Sarah Albright was a widow in her 50s, with a broad, kind face and hands that, while calloused, were surprisingly gentle. She ran the town's boarding house, a clean, quiet building that smelled of baking bread and lye soap. She took one look at Clara's ragged clothes, her wild hair, and the deep, exhausted terror in her eyes, and clucked her tongue. "Judge Thorne does like to send me the hard cases," she said, her voice a warm contralto. "You come with me, dear. There's water heating on the stove, and a room that's quiet. No one will bother you." The kindness, so freely given, was almost Clara's undoing. She followed the woman numbly up the stairs to a small, neat room. A large copper tub sat in the corner. "The bath will be ready in a moment. I'll lay out one of my daughter's old dresses. It should fit you well enough." When Sarah left, Clara sank onto the small, quilt-covered bed. It was soft. She was in a real room. She was safe. The tension of the last year, the last few days, crashed down on her. The bath was an absolution. She scrubbed away the grime of the trail, the smell of the fight, the cold of the mountain. She watched the water turn gray, as if she were washing away the woman she had been. When she was clean, she dried herself with a thick cotton towel and put on the dress. It was a simple, dark blue calico, worn soft with washing, but it had a proper bodice, a real skirt. It was the first woman's dress she had worn in almost a year. She turned to the small, silvered mirror on the wall. She had avoided her reflection for months. Now, she looked. The woman who stared back was a stranger. Her face was thin, her cheekbones high and sharp. Her skin was tanned by the high-altitude sun, no longer the pale porcelain of a city girl. Her eyes, which had been wide and frightened, were now clear, steady, and old. They were the eyes of a person who had survived. Her hands, resting on the washstand, were red and calloused. She didn't recognize this person, but she wasn't afraid of her. This woman was not a victim. She was not a fugitive. She was, Clara realized, herself. A knock came. "Clara, dear," it was Sarah. "The judge has sent for you. He's in the town square." The town square was a muddy patch of ground between the courthouse and the general store. A crowd had gathered. News had spread. The wild mountain man and his fugitive woman were in town. There had been a killing. Whispers followed Clara as she walked beside Sarah, the same whispers she had fled in Philadelphia. Men stared. Women gathered in small, tight knots, their faces pinched with judgment. "That's her," one woman hissed, loud enough to be heard. "The one who murdered that man, and living in sin with him up on the ridge." Clara's stomach tightened. She had been a fool to hope. The law could not change this. Then she saw Elias. He was standing on the courthouse steps, beside Judge Thorne. He had not been put in a cell. He was standing there, free, watching for her. When he saw her, his breath caught. He had never seen her as anything but a half-starved, desperate creature in rags. Seeing her now, clean, her face calm, in a simple dress that showed the lines of her body. He looked at her as if for the first time. Judge Thorne raised his hand for silence. The crowd quieted. "Some of you have heard rumors," the judge called out, his voice booming across the mud. "Time to put them to rest. Some of you met a man named Harlan. He came here looking to hire men, flashing a bounty poster." Several men in the crowd shuffled, looking guilty. That bounty was a private contract, a vendetta. It was not the law. Mr. Harlan and his men went to Mr. Carver's land and attacked his home. A murmur went through the crowd. A man's home, his land, that was sacred. "Mr. Carver and Miss Boone here," he motioned to Clara, "defended themselves. Harlan and one of his men are dead. The other two, who I believe are known to some of you, fled. Warrants are being issued for their arrest. What happened on Beartooth Ridge was a clear act of self-defense." He held up a piece of paper, a telegram. "And as for the original charge, I have received a wire from the district attorney in Philadelphia. In light of the Abernathy family's illegal bounty and the new testimony, they are unenthusiastic about pursuing extradition. They have dropped the charges." He turned, his gaze finding Clara. "Miss Boone, you are a free woman. The bounty is void. The charges are gone. You are free to go." A stunned, uncertain silence fell over the square. Clara felt her knees buckle. Free. The word was too big. She had won. But the glares had not softened. The woman in the black bonnet turned to her friend. "Dropped is not the same as innocent," she whispered, her voice like vinegar. "And she was still living with him. It's shameless." Clara heard her. The victory turned to ash in her mouth. She was free, but she was still an outcast. She would always be the woman who killed, the woman who lived in sin. She stared at the mud, her brief moment of triumph gone. Then she saw his boots in front of her. Elias. He had walked down the steps, ignoring the judge, ignoring the crowd. He stood right in front of her, in the middle of the square, forcing everyone to look. He held out his hand, his large, scarred, calloused hand. Clara stared at it. "Clara," he said, his voice low and rough, but it carried in the silence. "When you came to my cabin, you said you weren't there to marry. You said you were just there to work." The crowd gasped. The whispering woman's jaw dropped. Clara's head snapped up, her eyes wide, her heart stopping. Elias looked at her, his eyes serious, holding hers, blocking out the rest of the world. "That's still true?" She looked at his face. He was not ashamed. He was not hiding. He was standing in the center of their judgment, and he was offering her his hand. He was offering her his name. He was offering her everything. He was choosing her publicly, defiantly. The whispers, the glares, the years of shame, they vanished. She did not say yes. She did not speak at all. She laid her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers. A warm, solid, perfect fit. And then, in front of the judge, the widow, and the entire scandalized town, Clara Boone stood on her toes, pulled his face down to hers, and kissed him. It was not a chaste, polite kiss. It was a kiss of survival, of promise, of a wild and boundless relief. It was the kiss of the storm, the desperation of the riverbank, and the peace of the high meadow. All at once, it was a claiming. A collective, sharp intake of breath came from the crowd. Elias didn't care. He smiled against her mouth, the first real, unguarded smile she had ever seen. He wrapped his arms around her, lifting her clear off the ground, and kissed her back, sealing their future in the middle of the town square. They did not get married in the church. They did not ask the judge, though he offered. 3 days later, after signing the papers that cleared Elias of the Old Snake River charge and collecting the deed to Harlan's horse, they rode back up the mountain. They stopped in the high meadow, where the stream ran clear and the wind soughed in the pines. There was no preacher, no organ music, just the sound of the wind and the call of a hawk high overhead. Elias took her hand. He had finished his carving. He pulled it from his pocket. It was the pendant, the small, wooden bird with its wings spread wide, sanded smooth as glass, and hung on a thin leather cord. He placed it over her head. "I, Elias Carver, take you, Clara Boone, to be my wife," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he wasn't used to. "I'll shelter you, I'll fight for you, I'll build you a home, with my own 2 hands." Tears streamed down Clara's face, but she was smiling. She laid her hand over the small bird at her throat. "I, Clara Boone, take you, Elias Carver, to be my husband. I will stand with you. I will be your home." He kissed her, and in the high, lonely wilderness, under the sight of nothing but the sky, they were married. When they returned to the ridge, the old cabin felt small and cold and haunted by the ghosts of the fight. "I don't want to live here," Clara said, standing in the doorway, looking at the dark stain on the rug. "Me neither," Elias agreed. This was a place to hide. We're done hiding. The next morning, he picked up his axe. "Let's build something that lasts." They spent the summer building their home. Not a cabin, a home. Elias felled the trees, and Clara, her body lean and strong from a winter of hard labor, helped him peel the bark and notch the logs. They built it 50 yards up the ridge, on a flat ledge with a view of the entire valley. It had 2 rooms, and 2 real glass windows that Elias had hauled up on the mule. It had a wide stone hearth that Clara had designed. As the snows fell, they were not trapped. They were safe. The winter passed, giving way to a warm, wet spring. The snow melted, and the ridge came alive with green. One evening, the wind howled, a familiar, wild sound, but it was a warm wind, smelling of pine and damp earth. Clara stood at the new hearth, tending a pot of stew. The fire burned hot and steady. She was humming, her hand resting on her belly, which was softly rounded with new life. The door opened, letting in a gust of air. Elias came in. He carried a fresh kill, and his face was relaxed, content. He set the rabbit on the table and came up behind her, sliding his arms around her waist, his large, warm hands spreading to cover the swell of her stomach. He pressed his face into her hair, kissing her neck. She leaned back against his solid, comforting strength, her hands covering his. "You still just here to work?" he teased, his voice a low rumble. Clara smiled, tipping her head back against his shoulder. She looked at the warm, fire-lit room, at the small, empty cradle he had spent the winter carving, waiting by the fire. "I guess I changed my mind." Outside, the wind howled against the ridge, a wild, lonely sound. But inside, the love burned hot and steady. They had survived. They were, finally, home. Thank you for listening to this story from Wild West. We truly hope you enjoyed the journey of Elias and Clara. We'd love to know where in the world you're listening from, so please drop a comment and let us know. Your thoughts are what keep us going, so please share your feelings about the story in English. And if you loved this tale, don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West so you never miss a new adventure.